11 September 1962. Central Munich. The light falls through office windows on Schillerstrasse, catching dust motes above a desk where papers wait in neat stacks. Heinz Krug waters a potted plant by the glass, a gesture so ordinary it will later seem impossible to reconcile with what follows. Traffic moves below. A calendar shows Tuesday. Press accounts would eventually compress the afternoon into a single flat sentence. The German rocket scientist left his office and never came home. His Mercedes 300 SE would be found 2 days later, abandoned. No body was ever recovered. A later intelligence chronology, cited in multiple histories of the period, offers only this. Krug disappeared from Munich, believed killed. The plant by the window would go unwatered. The coffee cup on his desk would grow cold. Outside, the September afternoon remained indifferent. The cost of what happened next would be measured in other cities, in parcels addressed by hand. By the early hours of 21 July 1962, in a desert test range roughly 50 miles northwest of Cairo, 4 Egyptian missiles arced into the pre-dawn sky, while invited foreign journalists watched from a distant ridge. The rocket's variants designated Al-Qahir and Al-Zafir climbed, separated, and descended somewhere beyond the horizon. President Gamal Abdel Nasser would later announce that these new weapons could strike targets just south of Beirut, a phrase captured in newsreel audio and replayed in Israeli intelligence briefings for weeks afterward. 2 days later, Cairo's July Revolution Day parade carried the same missile shapes through streets lined with civilians, their casings wrapped in flags, moving past balconies where children waved. In Tel Aviv, the same footage arrived on different desks. Inside Israel's intelligence headquarters, cables summarizing the Egyptian tests were placed beside a growing file on Factory 333, the military-industrial complex near Heliopolis, where German engineers were reportedly developing the rockets. The reports described estimated ranges, projected production numbers, and most troubling, the presence of technicians once tied to Peenemünde, the wartime German missile center on the Baltic coast. Names appeared: Wolfgang Pils, Paul Gerke, Hans Kleinwächter, Heinz Krug. For Israeli analysts reviewing the material, the threat remained abstract in some ways. Numbers on cables, parades on grainy film, but the reaction inside Mossad and military intelligence was intensely human. Later histories would describe a sense of shock, an internal assessment that Egypt's public announcement represented one of the most traumatic intelligence developments the agency had faced. The missiles were imprecise, the warheads conventional, but the symbolism was unmistakable. German engineers, some with Nazi-era credentials, were building weapons aimed at Jewish cities. The same rockets paraded in Cairo's daylight would soon be linked, in classified files, to letters and parcels addressed by hand. By late 1961 and into early 1962, before the rockets were shown publicly, a stream of German scientists had already been traveling quietly to Egypt. On paper, they were civilian experts, employed on industrial projects. In internal documents circulating through Israeli and West German intelligence services, they were categorized as former Hitler engineers, working on medium-range missiles at Factory 333. The key figures emerged gradually in press reports and later scholarly work. Eugen Senger, who had headed the Stuttgart Institute for Jet Propulsion Physics, left that position under political pressure and was soon linked to Egypt's program as a senior consultant. Though he would eventually step back from direct involvement, Wolfgang Pils brought experience in propulsion systems. Paul Gorky specialized in guidance technology. Hans Kleinwächter worked on electronic components. Heinz Krug, a lawyer by training who had worked at Peenemünde during the war, now ran Intra-Handelsgesellschaft, a company registered in Stuttgart in July 1960 that channeled equipment and expertise to Cairo. Photographs from the period show German technicians in shirt sleeves visiting laboratories and factories in Heliopolis, sometimes accompanied by Egyptian military officers. Life around Factory 333 included guest houses, social clubs, and restaurants, all the visible habits of an expatriate community abroad. What the photographs did not capture was the security apparatus reportedly established by Hermann Adolf Valentin, a former SS officer hired by the Egyptians to protect the scientists after threats began arriving. The contrast was deliberate in how the story would later be told. On camera, the men appeared to be civilians, pursuing technical careers abroad. In Mossad files, they were categorized as potential enablers of missiles aimed at Israel's cities. Nasser's government had deliberately sought such expertise to reduce reliance on Soviet or Western suppliers, framing the missile program as a symbol of Arab independence. For Israeli planners reviewing the intelligence, the combination of Holocaust-era biographies and new rockets felt like an existential trigger wrapped in technical specifications. The same men who blended into Cairo's cafes would later find their names on envelopes packed with explosives. In August 1962, in Tel Aviv, Mossad director Isser Harel presented a grim assessment to Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. According to accounts compiled later by journalists and historians, Harel reported that German scientists in Egypt were developing hundreds of missiles and might be working toward non-conventional warheads. The intelligence was fragmentary, some of it speculation, but Harel's thinking had been shaped by his role in the recent capture of Adolf Eichmann. He viewed the presence of ex-Nazi engineers in Nasser's program as an intolerable convergence of past atrocity and future threat. The institutional response took shape through paper. A small operational unit was reportedly tasked with taking the campaign abroad, with Yitzhak Shamir among those involved in directing activities. Mossad at this time lacked a fully developed paramilitary branch, so Shin Bet teams and other assets were drawn into the effort. Lists accumulated. Names, addresses in Germany and Egypt, family connections, assessments of which targets were most critical and which might be moved by pressure alone. Harel would later be quoted as saying, in justification of his approach, "There are people who are marked to die." In the operational dossiers, that statement sat beside routine bureaucratic language about assets, mailings, and technical measures. The vocabulary of intelligence work had a way of flattening human decisions into procedural categories. What emerged was not a single operation, but a campaign later designated Operation Damocles, in some accounts that would combine intimidation, sabotage, letter bombs, and targeted killings. The goal was to make Egypt's missile program so dangerous for its personnel that the scientists would abandon their work. Whether this could be achieved without triggering a larger diplomatic crisis remained, at this stage, a secondary consideration. Somewhere in that stack of papers lay a line that turned cautious intelligence tracking into a program of threats, explosions, and disappearances. The narrative must step back briefly to understand how the names on Mossad's lists arrived in Cairo. At Peenemünde, on the Baltic coast in the early 1940s, German engineers had developed the V-2 rocket under Werner von Braun's direction. Among those who worked in the program was a younger Heinz Krug, whose legal training had brought him into the administrative apparatus of the rocket facility. Wolfgang Pils and others later associated with Egypt's missiles were also connected to German wartime research. After the war, the same expertise scattered. Some scientists went to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Others remained in Germany, finding positions in aerospace institutes and industrial consultancies. By the late 1950s, their names appeared in new contexts. Contracts with foreign governments seeking to develop indigenous missile capabilities. Egypt's interest was straightforward. Nasser wanted weapons that did not depend on Soviet goodwill or Western approval. German engineers, many of them unemployable in their home country's defense sector due to post-war restrictions, offered technical knowledge without political strings. The arrangement benefited both parties, at least until it attracted attention. Krug registered Intra-Handelsgesellschaft in Stuttgart in July 1960. The company served as a procurement channel, acquiring components and facilitating contracts between German suppliers and Egyptian military clients. By 1962, Krug was also representing United Arab Airlines in Munich, a connection that reinforced his ties to the Arab world while maintaining a civilian cover. For the engineers, available evidence suggests a mix of motivations: professional ambition, financial incentive, and varying degrees of reckoning with their wartime past. For Israeli intelligence analysts, none of that complexity mattered. The combination of Pinamunde credentials and Cairo addresses was sufficient to place names on operational lists. In 1962, the line between engineer and enemy was redrawn, not in a desert laboratory but in the margins of intelligence memoranda. On 11 September 1962, Munich becomes the focal point of what would remain an unresolved disappearance. Contemporary police reports and later investigations agree on the basic outline. Heinz Krug spent part of the day at his office on Schillerstrasse. He left. He was not seen again by colleagues or family. His Mercedes 300 SE was discovered 2 days later. No body was recovered. The facts end there. What follows is contested ground. Krug's firm Intra was known to handle contracts with Egypt's military-industrial complex. He traveled regularly to Cairo and was identified in multiple sources as a key civilian intermediary in the missile project. Munich police materials from the period and the later public controversy over German rocket experts in Egypt treat his disappearance as part of that wider affair, though no official determination of responsibility was ever made. Accounts of what happened diverge sharply. Some journalistic and historical works, drawing on unnamed former intelligence sources, attribute Krug's death to an operation involving Otto Skorzeny, the former SS commando who had reportedly been recruited by Mossad and allegedly carried out the killing on Israeli orders. Ronan Bergman and other researchers offer a different version. A Mossad team, possibly including Harel himself, abducted Krug near Munich, flew him to Israel, interrogated him, and killed him there. None of these narratives has been corroborated by publicly released official documents. No remains have been found. A Munich court would eventually declare Krug legally dead, but the circumstances remained unknown. For his family, the fact was stark. A husband and father disappeared between his office and home. For those who may have targeted him, the operation was later folded into a larger argument that intimidation was necessary to break Egypt's missile program. In the files, Krug's case became an entry on a timeline. By late November 1962, Cairo's Heliopolis district became the center of a different kind of action. Factory 333 sat among other military and industrial sites in the area, its German personnel working on missile components under Egyptian supervision. On 27 November 1962, a parcel addressed to Wolfgang Pils arrived at his office. Multiple sources agree on the essentials. His secretary and companion, identified in contemporary accounts as Hannelore Wende, opened the package. It detonated. The explosion seriously injured her and left her permanently blind. Shortly before or after sources differ on the exact sequence, another parcel bomb exploded in an Egyptian facility linked to the missile program at Heliopolis, killing 5 Egyptian workers and injuring others. Press photographs from the aftermath show wrecked workspaces and the grim routine of emergency response. From the Israeli side, letter bombs were described in later accounts of Operation Damocles as a principal tactical tool. They could reach targets that were difficult to approach directly, penetrating offices and homes without requiring physical confrontation. The campaign targeted not only scientists themselves but also firms supplying components to the Egyptian program. These explosions marked a shift in the nature of the conflict. Until this point, most of the story had involved projections of future missiles, estimates, assessments, parades. Now the casualties were immediate. Egyptian workers killed in a factory explosion were remembered, if at all, in brief local reports. Wende's blindness was noted as a tragic outcome in some Western coverage, but her subsequent life largely disappeared from the public record. Intelligence terminology tends to categorize such losses as collateral damage. The language cannot capture individual lives. A secretary opening a package meant for someone else, factory workers arriving for a shift that would be their last. From this point onward, every envelope arriving at a scientist's desk in Egypt carried not just correspondence but the possibility of violence. On 20 February 1963, in West Germany, an attempted killing demonstrated that the campaign was not confined to letters. According to German and Israeli sources compiled later, Hans Kleinwechter, a guidance specialist working on components for Egypt's missiles, was ambushed near his home in the town of Lörrach. Gunmen opened fire on his car. He survived unharmed. The reconstruction of the incident remains partial. A street at night. A vehicle slowing. Shots fired. Footsteps retreating. The exact route, the number of assailants, and their identities were never confirmed in public records. Intelligence chronologies compiled afterward noted that Israel was believed to have dispatched a team, that a weapon reportedly jammed or the aim failed, and that Kleinwechter walked away from an attack meant to kill him. In operational histories and memoirs, failed attempts like this one tend to be treated as tactical problems, issues of weapons, surveillance, timing. But government documents and press coverage from the period reveal another dimension: diplomatic exposure. When covert activities spill into Western European jurisdictions, where Israel maintained important relationships, the human impact ran in two directions. Kleinwechter had to live with the knowledge that someone had tried to kill him because of his professional work. He continued his involvement with the Egyptian program for a time but eventually left. For the operatives and commanders on the Israeli side, the failed attempt raised uncomfortable questions about proportionality and risk, not only the risk of death for targets, but the risk of arrest and international scandal. A jammed weapon in a German suburb bought time for debates in ministries across multiple capitals. It also left unfinished business in the minds of those who had planned the operation. In early March 1963, Basel became the stage for the most publicly documented incident in Operation Damocles. Swiss police files and contemporary press reports describe how two men, identified as Joseph Ben Gal, an Israeli citizen, and Otto Joklik, an Austrian scientist, met Heidi Gurke, daughter of guidance expert Paul Jens Gurke, in the city on 2 March. Court documents and press summaries reconstruct the encounter in clinical terms. The men attempted to pressure or coerce Heidi, by then a young lawyer, to persuade her father to abandon his work on Egypt's missile program. According to testimony presented at trial, they threatened harm to the Gurke family if he did not comply. Swiss authorities, apparently tipped off in advance, intervened. Ben Gal and Joklik were arrested. The subsequent trial linked the coercion case to the broader campaign of letter bombs and assassination attempts against German scientists. The men were convicted of making threats and acting on behalf of a foreign state. The proceedings generated headlines across Europe. The meeting had taken place not in a desert facility or clandestine safe house, but in a public European setting, a hotel or restaurant, tables and glasses, other patrons nearby. The threats, as described in court testimony, were delivered across an ordinary table, possibly over coffee. The domestic and the operational collided directly. For Mossad, the arrest represented a severe setback, public exposure of methods and personnel, diplomatic embarrassment, and legal vulnerability. For Heidi Gurke, it meant that the danger connected to her father's work had entered her own daily life in a documented, courtroom-verified way. In Basel, the conflict over rockets briefly became visible not in a missile test or an explosion, but in a witness stand where a daughter was asked to repeat what had been said to her. By March and April 1963, the Basel case and related incidents had triggered political waves across multiple countries. Swiss court proceedings linked the coercion charges to the broader pattern of letter bombs and assassination attempts against German scientists. Press coverage named Israel as the state behind the operations. West German newspapers, already reporting anxiously on the affair over German rocket experts working for Nasser, connected the fragments into a larger controversy. Scientists with Nazi pasts, employed by Egypt, targeted by Israeli agents on European soil. Headlines accumulated. One New York Times piece from 1 April 1963 reported that Israel's chief of security had resigned, linking the development to the affair over German scientists and Egypt's missiles. In parliamentary debates in Bonn, officials defended their citizens' legal right to work abroad while acknowledging the political sensitivities involved. In Jerusalem, foreign ministry diplomats argued that ongoing covert attacks were undermining efforts to normalize relations with West Germany, a process that involved reparations, payments, and complex negotiations over the Holocaust's legacy. The operation that had begun as a secret effort to deter or eliminate a specific threat was now entangled with public diplomacy, compensation, politics, and the memory of genocide in both countries. Every letter bomb and every courtroom revelation fed into larger questions about how Israel should pursue its security and how Germany should reckon with its past. For the operatives who had planted devices and issued threats, the exposure transformed their work from classified success into political liability. For the families of scientists in Egypt, the publicity offered some protection. It became harder to act covertly against targets whose names were now in newspapers worldwide. Once the story reached front pages, the operation's success could no longer be measured only in whether rockets were built but also in which alliances fractured. In late March 1963, the internal cost of the campaign crystallized in Israel. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, under pressure from foreign ministry officials concerned about diplomatic fallout and the broader relationship with West Germany, demanded that Isser Harel halt the operations. According to accounts from the period, Harel refused to abandon what he viewed as a necessary defense against existential danger. Ben-Gurion insisted on his resignation. The turning point played out through documents rather than dramatic confrontation. Histories, drawing on memoirs and interviews, describe how Harel's fixation on the German scientists, shaped by his central role in capturing Adolf Eichmann 2 years earlier, had diverged from the priorities of Ben-Gurion, Foreign Minister Golda Meir, and other political figures who emphasized strategic relationships and international standing. Meir Amit succeeded Harel as Mossad director. In later assessments, he would suggest that his predecessor may have overestimated both the scale and immediacy of the Egyptian missile threat, particularly given the program's technical limitations and the availability of other means, diplomatic, economic, political, to pressure the scientists and their employers. Yitzhak Shamir and several operatives reportedly resigned in protest over Harel's treatment, indicating the depth of loyalty and conviction within the operational ranks. For those who had carried out the campaign, the political reversal felt like abandonment. For those who had opposed it, the resignation represented a necessary correction. The recurring motif of the affair shifted. What began as lists of targets and parcels prepared in safe houses now appeared as resignation letters, internal memoranda, and newspaper clippings. The boundaries of what Israel would and would not do abroad were being redrawn in the aftermath of exposure. The rockets had not reached Tel Aviv, but the operation meant to stop them had already cost a director, exposed agents, and strained alliances. By the end of 1963, a pattern became visible in governmental reports and press coverage. Many of the German scientists working on Egypt's missile program had left, returning to West Germany or accepting positions elsewhere. Death threats, parcel bombs, and the Basel trial had made their work in Egypt both personally dangerous and politically untenable. West German authorities, under pressure from Israel and responding to domestic public opinion, quietly encouraged returns by offering research posts and contracts. The evidence of this exodus appeared in scattered references. Newspaper items noting a scientist's return from Cairo, parliamentary answers about the number of German nationals still working abroad, statements by lawyers representing affected families. The campaign had achieved at least part of its objective, not necessarily by eliminating targets, but by making continuation of the work too costly. Reports on Factory 333 indicated that production continued for a time, but Egypt's indigenous missile development faced growing technical and logistical difficulties. By the late 1960s, Nasser would turn increasingly to Soviet-provided Scud missiles instead of domestically produced weapons. The dream of an independent Egyptian rocket capability faded. The human cost remained unevenly documented. The Egyptian workers killed by the factory bomb were remembered, if at all, in brief references difficult to retrieve from local archives. Hannelore Wende's blindness was mentioned as a tragic outcome in various accounts of the affair, but her life after 1962 largely disappeared from the historical record. The scientists who left Egypt survived. Some continued their careers in Germany without further incident. Official histories would later note that the scientists left Egypt under pressure. But the pressure had been measured in more than diplomatic cables and parliamentary questions. It had been measured in parcels that exploded and shots fired on quiet streets. In retrospectives written decades later, Analysts and former officials often draw a line from Operation Damocles to Israel's broader pattern of targeting scientists involved in hostile weapons programs. The German engineers of the early 1960s would be followed, in subsequent decades, by operations against Iraqi nuclear scientists, Iranian missile experts, and others whose technical knowledge was deemed threatening to Israeli security. The documentary record invites questions rather than conclusions. Damocles combined intimidation, attempted assassination, and diplomatic pressure. Its immediate effectiveness in halting Egypt's indigenous missile program remains debated. The program faced serious technical limitations, regardless of Israeli intervention, and Egypt's subsequent reliance on Soviet weapons suggests the indigenous effort might have failed on its own terms. Yet the campaign's psychological and institutional impact on Israeli intelligence was clearer. It established, within Mossad's operational culture, the principle that scientists themselves could be treated as legitimate targets when their work threatened the state's existence. The moral language surrounding such decisions shifted over time from the necessity of preventing another Holocaust to technical discussions of proportionality and strategic consequence. Studies of the period, including works by researchers who gained access to former officials and classified materials, highlight how the vocabulary changed even as the underlying logic remained consistent. What Harel framed as existential defense became, in later operations, a matter of deterrence and capability denial. For those who participated in Damocles, memoirs and interviews tend to be spare on introspection, constrained by ongoing secrecy and the passage of years. What emerged instead was an institutional memory, an understanding that similar decisions would be made again, framed as lessons learned rather than wounds examined. By the time later targets were identified, the methods felt refined. The unresolved questions from the early 1960s remained embedded in every operational file. The closing image returns to where the story began. An office in Munich, a desk in Cairo, a table in Basel. The dates are scattered across months: 11 September 1962 for Krug's disappearance, 27 November 1962 for the Pils letter bomb, 20 February 1963 for the Kleinwächter ambush, 2 March 1963 for the Basel meeting, but they exist on adjacent pages in the files. No new revelations emerge from the archival record. The narrator can only recite the minimal, agreed facts. Krug vanished and was later declared dead by a Munich court. His family eventually published their own account, still living with questions that have no answers. Wende survived but lost her sight. Her subsequent years are unrecorded in accessible sources. The Egyptian workers at Heliopolis are named, if at all, only in local reports now difficult to retrieve. The recurring motif of paper and envelopes takes its final form in a simple image. Correspondence files from the period, preserved in archives, addressed to scientists who have long since departed Egypt and, in some cases, departed life. The postmarks read 1962, 1963. The handwriting belongs to people whose intentions, business, threat, or something in between cannot always be determined from the outside of an envelope. What can be said is only this. In those years, decisions made in the name of security traveled by post and by plane, through offices and homes, leaving behind not only fewer rockets in a desert factory, but a trail of emptied rooms and unanswered questions. The plant by the Munich window appears in one archival photograph from the period still, ordinary, indifferent to who never walked back through the door.